Overnight, 300 American factories just lost their biggest customer, Canada. From auto parts to agriculture machinery, Canadian buyers canceled contracts worth billions of dollars, sending shockwaves through U.S. manufacturing towns. Plants that once ran 24/7 are now cutting shifts, laying off workers, and bracing for shutdowns. Politicians are scrambling for answers, unions are furious, and economists warn this could trigger a new industrial recession. But here's the bigger question. Why would Canada suddenly walk away from American factories, and which states will feel the pain first? Today we're breaking down the fallout, and the 10 industries hit hardest. 1. Auto manufacturing. The U.S. auto industry was one of the hardest hit when Canada pulled the plug. For decades, American factories in Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana have built cars and parts that flow north across the border. But Canada's new trade law shifts billions of dollars in contracts toward domestic Canadian suppliers and Asian partners. Overnight, plants in Detroit and Toledo lost major deals to supply engines, transmissions, and electric vehicle batteries. These contracts weren't just numbers on paper, they represented thousands of union jobs. Workers who had just celebrated expansions tied to the EV boom are now staring down layoffs. Why did Canada make this move? Partly politics, partly economics. Ottawa wants to reduce reliance on U.S. parts and build up its own EV supply chain, especially after disputes over tariffs and subsidies. The ripple effect is massive. American steel and aluminum producers are also feeling the squeeze, since auto parts manufacturing relies heavily on their supply. Even railroads that transport these goods are seeing freight volumes fall. For auto towns that once symbolized industrial America's strength, this is a gut punch. Families tied to factory paychecks are now left wondering if the motor of America's economy is running out of gas. 1. Steel and aluminum. Canada is one of the largest buyers of American steel and aluminum, used in everything from construction to aerospace. But in 2025, that pipeline just shut down. Ottawa has announced it will prioritize European and domestic suppliers, cutting U.S. mills out of lucrative contracts. For Rust Belt states like Pennsylvania and Ohio, this couldn't come at a worse time. Mills that were already struggling with global competition now face a sudden collapse in demand. Union leaders are warning of mass layoffs, while local governments brace for plunging tax revenues. What triggered this decision? Canadian officials cite national security and supply diversification as key reasons. After years of trade disputes with Washington, including U.S. tariffs on Canadian steel in past administrations, Ottawa is playing hardball. The economic fallout is staggering. The American Iron and Steel Institute estimates the U.S. could lose over $4 billion annually from this shift. Communities built around steel plants, from Pittsburgh to Gary, Indiana, now face another wave of uncertainty. Many families remember the devastating mill closures of the 1980s. For them, this feels like history repeating itself, only faster. 1. Agriculture equipment. When you think of U.S. exports to Canada, you might picture corn or beef. But one of the biggest categories has always been agriculture machinery, tractors, harvesters, irrigation systems. In 2025, Canada cut hundreds of millions in contracts with American equipment makers, turning instead to European and domestic suppliers. Factories in Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin are reeling. Companies like John Deere, Case IH, and Caterpillar relied heavily on Canadian buyers for everything from mid-sized tractors to high-tech precision agriculture tools. These cancellations mean factory lines are slowing, dealers are slashing orders, and rural towns are bracing for job losses. Why the sudden shift? Canada is investing heavily in its own green agriculture technology. The U.S. fallout goes beyond lost sales. Steel suppliers, electronics manufacturers, and software engineers who make the components of modern farm machines are all affected. The supply chain shock is cascading through the Midwest. For small towns where a single plant employs half the community, the danger is clear. When the contracts dry up, so do the paychecks. Families who've built livelihoods around factory work are left questioning whether their towns will survive this latest blow. 1. Aerospace. The aerospace industry is another sector reeling from Canada's overnight cuts. For years, American companies supplied aircraft components, avionics systems, and engines for Canadian carriers and manufacturers. Boeing and dozens of subcontractors across Kansas, Washington, and Texas relied on Canadian contracts to keep production lines moving. But in 2025, Ottawa redirected major aerospace contracts toward European suppliers like Airbus and Canada's own Bombardier Aerospace, effectively sidelining U.S. factories. The consequences for U.S. plants are immediate. Wichita, Kansas, often called the air capital of the world, is bracing for significant layoffs in aerospace parts manufacturing. Suppliers of specialized metals, composites, and electronics are already reporting canceled orders. Industry experts warn that the ripple effects could reach far beyond aerospace. U.S. defense contractors fear that if Canada shifts civilian contracts away from the U.S., military procurement partnerships may also weaken. For American aerospace workers, the message is chilling. Jobs once seen as stable and high-tech are suddenly at risk, leaving communities tied to aviation facing a rough landing. 1. Energy equipment. One of the most surprising moves in Canada's new trade law is the cutback on U.S. energy equipment. For decades, American companies supplied pipelines, drilling machinery, and renewable energy technology for Canada's booming oil sands and wind projects. But as of 2025, Canada is shifting billions in orders to domestic firms and European green tech leaders. Texas, Oklahoma, and North Dakota are feeling the heat. Factories producing drilling rigs and pipeline components are reporting steep drops in Canadian demand. Renewable firms in California and Colorado that once exported solar inverters and wind turbine parts are also losing contracts. Canada's reasoning is twofold. First, Ottawa is making a political bet on green energy. By favoring domestic and European suppliers, it aims to accelerate its own clean energy industry while reducing dependency on U.S. fossil fuel infrastructure. The consequences are stark. Energy towns in the U.S. that rely on Canadian orders are facing cutbacks, with some local leaders warning of ghost town scenarios if plants shut down. For thousands of American workers, this trade fallout isn't just about contracts. It's about the future of energy itself. 1. Medical devices. Another sector blindsided by Canada's contract cuts is medical devices. U.S. factories in Minnesota, Massachusetts, and California have long supplied everything from surgical instruments to imaging machines across Canadian hospitals. But Ottawa just announced that it will shift procurement toward European and domestic suppliers to build healthcare resilience. The timing couldn't be worse. Many U.S. device manufacturers were counting on Canadian demand to offset slowdowns in Asia and Europe. Now those plants are facing order reductions of up to 40%. Workers in Minneapolis, a hub for medical device innovation, are already seeing hiring freezes and looming layoffs. Canada argues the change is about supply security. After the pandemic exposed vulnerabilities in global medical supply chains, Ottawa is determined never to rely too heavily on one country again, especially the U.S., given past export restrictions during crises. For American manufacturers, this decision not only slashes sales but also threatens research budgets. High-end medical devices require massive R&D investments, and without steady demand, innovation could stall. The blow is personal for workers too. Many of these factories employ multi-generational families who have built careers in precision manufacturing. Now, communities built around stable medical industry jobs are facing uncertainty, all because their northern neighbor decided to buy elsewhere. 1. Electronics and semiconductors. Electronics are the nervous system of modern economies, and for decades, Canada has relied on U.S. plants to supply semiconductors, circuit boards, and consumer electronics. But in 2025, Canada stunned the industry by canceling hundreds of contracts with American suppliers and instead striking deals with South Korea, Taiwan, and Europe. Factories in Texas, Arizona, and California, already strained by global chip shortages, are suddenly facing canceled orders worth billions. Semiconductor fabs in Phoenix and Austin are scaling back production forecasts, while smaller suppliers of circuit boards and chips for consumer devices are bracing for layoffs. Why the shift? Ottawa's official stance is supply chain security. Canada doesn't want to be caught in the middle of U.S.-China tech conflicts, so it's diversifying suppliers. The impact on American workers is devastating. Electronics plants, often located in mid-sized cities, provide high-paying technical jobs that are hard to replace. Communities built around these facilities, with local schools, housing markets, and small businesses depending on steady employment, now face major disruption. The bigger risk is strategic. By losing Canadian contracts, the U.S. risks ceding technological dominance in North America. Once Canadian buyers form long-term partnerships with Asian chip makers, American suppliers may never get that business back. 1. Chemicals and pharmaceuticals. The chemical and pharmaceutical industries are also being hit hard by Canada's new trade stance. U.S. plants in Louisiana, Texas, and New Jersey have long supplied industrial chemicals, plastics, and generic drugs to Canadian buyers. Now those contracts are being rerouted to European and domestic producers, The fallout is immediate. Chemical plants in Baton Rouge and Houston are reporting sharp order reductions. New Jersey pharmaceutical manufacturers, which export critical generics and raw materials for Canadian hospitals, face massive revenue cuts. Union leaders warn this could trigger thousands of job losses across the supply chain. Canada's rationale is clear: healthcare sovereignty. After the shortages during the pandemic, Ottawa is determined to prioritize local and European sources for life-saving drugs and chemical inputs. The financial hit is severe. Analysts estimate U.S. pharmaceutical and chemical exporters could lose over $5 billion annually. Smaller firms that depend heavily on Canadian orders may not survive the year. For American workers, the pain is already visible. Communities around chemical corridors, from Louisiana's Cancer Alley to New Jersey's Pharma Belt, are bracing for factory slowdowns. For families who've relied on these industries for generations, Canada's decision feels like a betrayal. 1. Food exports and processed goods. Perhaps the most surprising move was Canada's decision to slash imports of processed foods and beverages from U.S. factories. For decades, Canadian grocery shelves were stocked with American-made cereals, snacks, canned goods, and sodas. But now, Ottawa is imposing stricter food standards and redirecting contracts toward Canadian and European producers. Factories in Illinois, Ohio, and Georgia are reeling. Major brands that operated massive processing plants to serve the Canadian market are seeing orders vanish. Trucking companies that move these goods across the border are also reporting sharp revenue declines. Canada's reasoning? Officials say it's about food security and national branding. Ottawa wants Canadians to buy Canadian first and reduce reliance on U.S. food processing giants. For U.S. workers, though, the losses are real. Entire plants that specialized in products for Canadian shelves could face closure. Communities that once thrived on factory jobs are now looking at unemployment lines. The shift also raises questions about U.S.-Canada consumer ties. If Canadians get used to European or domestic alternatives, iconic American brands could permanently lose market share north of the border. 1. Rail and transport equipment. The final industry hit by Canada's contract cancellations is rail and transport equipment. U.S. factories in Pennsylvania, Illinois, and Nebraska long supplied locomotives, freight cars, and urban transit equipment to Canadian cities. But in 2025, Ottawa canceled dozens of these contracts, awarding them instead to Canadian or European firms. The impact on U.S. plants is immediate. Locomotive factories in Erie, Pennsylvania, and freight car facilities in the Midwest are facing layoffs. Why did Canada walk away? The government says it wants to rebuild domestic rail capacity while aligning more closely with European transit suppliers, especially as Canadian cities expand light rail and high-speed train projects. For American manufacturers, the loss is crippling. Analysts estimate the U.S. rail equipment industry could lose over $2 billion annually from Canadian cancellations. The broader risk is symbolic. U.S. dominance in North American transport equipment is fading. If Canada pivots permanently, U.S. firms could lose their long-standing foothold in infrastructure projects across the continent. For towns built on locomotive and freight manufacturing, the future looks uncertain and grim. Conclusion: 300 U.S. factories lost contracts overnight, and the ripple effects are only beginning. From autos to aerospace, from chemicals to food, the fallout threatens millions of American jobs. Canada says it's about sovereignty and diversification. But for U.S. workers, it feels like the ground has shifted beneath their feet. The question is, will Washington fight back, or is this the start of a permanent industrial decline? What do you think? Can America recover from this trade shock, or is Canada signaling a new era without U.S. dominance? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more breakdowns.